We're now at 5 o'clock, everybody, so welcome to the final lecture in our annual lecture series for 2024 to 25. It's been a great programme. Thank you very much, Jana, for organising it. And it's wonderful for our last speaker to have somebody who's so closely connected with the BAA. Those of us who were at the Peterborough conference will remember a fantastic conference and wonderful transactions edited by our speaker, who is a consultant archaeologist and is the cathedral archaeologist at Peterborough, but more importantly for this evening is the consultant archaeologist for Southwark. And we're going to hear a lot about, she tells me, the very lost Cloister of Southwark. But clearly there are some bits, so we look forward to finding out more about them. Thank you very much, Jackie.
Thank you. So I volunteered to give this talk because it's a piece of research that I've wanted to do for a long time, almost since I first became cathedral archaeologist more than 8 years ago. And it's apparent to the most casual visitor to Southwark Cathedral that its cloister is completely absent, even though it has a new alley on the north side of the church, which is roofed in glass as part of the Millennium Project. There is, however, an array of antiquarian drawings, maps, records, and actual stone fragments, enough, I hoped, to give a pretty realistic idea of the Cloister of St Mary Overy. As you will see, I was a little disappointed that even more was lost than I had hoped. So just to set the scene very briefly, in case anyone here is not familiar with the area, the Priory was located upstream or west of the southern bridgehead of London Bridge. There was definitely a pre-conquest religious house here, but we know almost nothing about it, and absolutely nothing about its physical appearance. So, the cloister and buildings, which are the subject of this talk, belong to the Augustinian Priory, founded at around 1106 by William de Warenne II and William Gifford, Bishop of Winchester. The Winchester connection was important. The priory lay in Surrey, in the Diocese of Winchester, and from the mid-12th century, the bishop's near-to-London residence, Winchester Palace, was the priory's westward neighbour. The bishops were good neighbours, frequently contributing to building and rebuilding parts of St Mary Overy, some documented and some represented by the arms of bishops carved in stone. Go back to that one. Given the relative lack of evidence, I'm going to cover everything I know about the cloister: its location, its size and shape, what we know about the ranges, the cloistral arcade, and finish with a rather interesting small sculptural group that I suspect belongs with the chapter house. As with around 35% of Augustinian cloisters, and thanks to David Robinson for this statistic, Southwark's was sited on the north side of the church. While there may have been other reasons as well, the presence of the main watercourse, the Thames, on the north side must also have been a major factor, since watercourses were such a key part of monastic topography. Its overall size and shape require a little more teasing out, since this is what it looks like today. The reason why nothing is visible is clear if I indulge in that archaeological favourite, map regression. So this is more or less how it looks now after the massive regeneration of the area in the 1980s. But this slide, this map shows the area as it was for nearly a century and a half, from around 1835 to 1974. And there are some rather wonderful aerial photographs from that long period as well. 1835 was, I suppose, marked by another regeneration, this time industrial, triggered by the rebuilding and move upstream of London Bridge. Almost the entire area of the medieval precinct was now occupied by wharves and warehouses, all built with deep basements, destroying archaeology. Narrow alleys and roads, Montague Close, still shape the area and respect the alignment of the old cloistral buildings, but nothing else. Stepping further back in time, into some of the earliest accurate mapping of London, although this is closer to the monastic period, much of the necessary detail was not recorded. For instance, there are very good records of the East Range, which projected north of the North Transepts and survived until 1835, yet it is not shown on this map. So between the dissolution and the early 19th century, the area, though bounded by the same roads and alleys, was subject to numerous piecemeal changes. It is difficult to make out particular changes on these 17th and 18th century maps and views, but the crowded and built-up character of the suburb, even in the old Priory precinct, is apparent. There are some small open areas, but only in Holler's half-map, half-view of 1667 does any open area match the location of the cloister. And still, even this close to the dissolution, the East Range, which did survive, cannot be made out. Documents of sale and rents give another view of the changing precinct. The 1545 grant of the Priory lands to Sir Anthony Browne mentions all messages, wharves and shops within the close, showing how far it had already moved from the idealised precinct of our imaginations. His son, Viscount Montague, built a house over part of the West Range, but their family's property was seized in 1643 and 1653. In 1740, the property had passed to the Overman family, and in 1775, 60 houses and 4 wharves are mentioned in an Act of Parliament, which is all consistent with these early maps. This is just to point out how much and how often the cloister and its ranges have been redeveloped, making it surprising that there is anything to say about it at all. Go back to this lovely picture. 16th century maps, like this one, probably based on the copperplate map, tend to be bird's eye views of London viewed from the south, so that in Southwark, the Priory church mostly hides what is on its north side, including the cloister. Nonetheless, we can say some things about it, and to date, the most detailed account is still Francis Dolman's still valuable and detailed 1882 history of the Priory of St Mary Overy, in which he gathers up information from earlier antiquaries, earlier maps and plans, and the minutes of the vestry. This is his plan before the major demolitions of the 1820s and 30s, onto which he has additionally added dashed lines to show the location of the former cloister and a further courtyard on the east side. And this became the standard plan of the cloister and precinct for over a century, until today, in fact. However, although the East Range survived and there was reasonable evidence for the location of the West Range, there was no hard evidence at all for the dashed line reconstruction, since these areas had already been destroyed and rebuilt over and over. Here, I just want to remark that I don't think the cloister was a long rectangle, as Dolman reconstructed it. Not only would this be at odds with every Augustinian plan I know, urban or rural, but there's also perfectly good evidence for a conventional more or less square cloister, which we'll see after looking at each range by turn. And we're going to start with the East Range, for which there is most evidence. At the north end of the range, there was no sacristy, but instead the chapter house directly adjoined the north transept of the church. So this is definitely in the minority, and David Robinson kindly gave me the statistics again, that around only 20% of Augustinian houses did not have a chamber, whether sacristy or slype or bookroom, between the church and the chapter house, although only 38 East Ranges survived to tell that tale. So this is the only part of the cloistral ranges to survive, left exposed after the Millennium Project, but now very difficult to photograph, as you can see. It comprises just the late 12th or early 13th century northeast corner of Spond, with a moulded capital, remnants of a high arch, and a simple base set at the level of a wall bench. Several coffin burials were found there during excavations in the late 60s and early 70s. And I'll return to the chapter house at the end of the talk after looking at the rest of the cloister. So, back to this plan. And so the remains of the East Range was described and drawn a few times before it was demolished, and it's one of these early illustrations that Dolman copied for his 1881 plan. And these early descriptions predate the much better understanding of monastic layouts of the late Victorian period, and so these early ones cannot always be followed clearly, nor is it always obvious which part is being described. However, John Carter first visited it in 1787, but only described it in the Builder 21 years later, by which time more had become dilapidated or even destroyed. He described the very fine and spacious crypt, say 100 feet by 25 feet, running north and south and attaching itself to the north transepts of the church. In the first and second divisions, that's the south bays, partition walls and doorways have been introduced, and in the Tudor mode, this choice pile is used for storing up coals and other articles. Over the crypt is the departing remnant of a sumptuous apartment. At the north end, a large window stopped up. On each side of the longitudinal range are doorways and small Tudor windows. The southern half, however, is nearly rendered a common loft, made so for a modern lumber repository, while the northern half shows the original open timber worked roof, supported by stone corbels. Unlike other antiquaries who suggested that this was the refectory, John Carter, correctly as we now think, identified this as the dormitory and suggested that it had been divided into cells. I particularly like his closing remark. Possessors of such kind of treasure are not over-solicitous to let the public see what they hold within their grasp, conscious, no doubt, they being intent about the means of dilapidation, that the less a revered object is seen, the less its loss is inquired into or sorrowed after. A little earlier, Tyler described a chapel, the roof of oak, in the centre a lanthorn light, which roof is supported by carved angels like to those in Westminster Hall. And the walls seem to have had paintings thereon. At the east end is a great window, now walled up. Perhaps it's projected east of the East Range, or, since the actual alignment of the range is northeast, perhaps he was describing exactly what Carter saw later. Oddly, as we've already seen, this range is not shown at all in early maps and plans, even though views of it do survive from the east. Typical for London and other urban contexts, the ground level must have risen, and on the cloister side have been more or less buried from as early as the late 16th century, and indeed in the early 19th, the soil was described as being as high as the window tops. But however, shortly before the range was destroyed in 1835, it was drawn and described by E.J. Carlos, also in the Builder, from which Dolman copied the plan and indeed the illustrations on the other side. The chapter house, back to Dolman. So, the chapter house and the church in this slide are off to the left. Carlos's description in the Builder is very lengthy, but it's worth noting that the ancient work had been much repaired in brick and defaced with many windows inserted without regard to taste or architectural effect, though presumably for function. It may be some of these which account for the door in the northeast corner and the consequent unusual vaulting at the north end, that's on the right, by comparison with the perfectly standard quadripartite vaulting in the other bays. Both the window and the door at this end were described as square-headed. The walls of the east range are described as being 4 foot thick on the undercroft and 3 feet thick on the first floor, and faced in Kentish rag, like some surviving examples in the cathedral church. The undercroft itself is shown as divided by several east-west walls, and while it was bound to have been divided originally, we can only guess how far this late arrangement, often brick, reflected earlier arrangements. The central piers were octagonal, with corbels supporting the vault along each side, and the vault ribs were chamfered with the vault cells filled with chalk. So 19th century understanding of the old bays at the north end, that's the left, was extremely muddled, and I think we can more simply say that the walled-off passage, that's here, was simply at the sides of the day stairs leading from the dormitory above to the cloister. The opposed doorways in the next bay, one of which was illustrated, may have been original. Carlos thought the vaulting to be later than the walls, but I see no reason to support that thesis. The whole seems much more likely to be early 13th century, perhaps built after the fire of 1212, said to have destroyed much of the Priory and of Southwark. Though in fact I should point out that many pre-fire features do survive on the north side of the church. Carlos also describes evidence for the north range of the Priory Court on the east side of the range. But as that's not the cloister, I'm not going to describe that at all today, which I've got no evidence. So I'm going to turn to the north range next. And Carlos then describes on the western side of the crypt were other corbels. They're not marked here, but here they're along here. And near that point, about 20 feet westward, was a wall extending in that direction, more than 100 feet, which was returned northwards. On the site of this supposed range were detached pieces of moulding, supposed from Norman to Renaissance guilloche. And the wall, I'm afraid, 20 feet to the west, I find too imprecisely described to know its date, its function, or its precise location. But the plan of the east range clearly contains the ghost of the north range in its west wall, in the long blank section here, which clearly divides the refectory from the dormitory undercroft. So going back to Dolman's overall plan, we can see how the width of my proposed north range more or less matches that of the east range. In fact, it's slightly different, so mine might be, in fact, slightly narrower. And Carlos, in fact, measured the width of the east range as 33 feet 6 inches, obviously including the wall widths. And all of a sudden, the cloister is looking much more conventional, with a north-south distance of around 85 or 86 feet, which also happens to be exactly the mean, and indeed the mode, side in David Robinson's early investigations into Augustinian geography. An eastern range projecting beyond the cloister is also pretty conventional, while the location of the central warehouse backing onto my purported north range, that's here, is further evidence that this could be the correct location. The blank wall on the east side, so that's here, not where these dashed lines are, must also surely represent another building or range, maybe the latrine block. Like the east range, the west range survived roughly in its original location up until 1828, but by that time it had been almost completely rebuilt. Only the late medieval gatehouse here on the left, with its upper timber floor and adjacent sexton's house, actually survived into the early 19th century, which led into a yard which later became the road on the west side of the West Range. Tradition has it that the prior's house was replaced by Sir Anthony Browne, who received numerous religious houses at the dissolution, and it became known as Montague House after his son, Viscount Montague. It stood at the north end of the range, while the house at the south end, shown here on the right, was possibly built in the early 16th century, had later been lived in by Thomas Cure, Queen Elizabeth I's saddler. A tiny fragment of medieval foundation was found during the Millennium excavations, that's in the green oval at the bottom, enough to be interpreted as the south end of the West Range and its associated cloister alley wall. This suggests that the original range was further west than the rebuilt range, as reconstructed here. This aligns the west side of the range with the gatehouse entry and gives broad alleys around the cloister. And the West Range is likely to may have continued northwards like the East Range, perhaps to house the main kitchen. Concannon and Morgan in 1795 record that one Mr. John Peacock hath lately taken down the north door leading to the refectory and cloister to make a gateway for his business, by which means part of the refectory is destroyed. I'm not quite certain what this means, since the north doorway into the refectory seems unlikely, unless perhaps as part of a screen's passage. I'm not going to say anything about the South Range, because it is, of course, the church. but just to note the two doorways by which the church could be entered from the cloister, the so-called canon's doorway and the so-called prior's doorway at the west and east ends of the nave, respectively. They are both examples of features that predate the fire of 1212, although today we can only see the result the rebuilt jambs of the exterior of one doorway and the much replaced plain interior of the other. The surviving chamfer stops, and indeed the surviving bases of the other doorway, demonstrate the much lower medieval floor level, which is about 80 centimetres lower than the current floor. So, having circumnavigated the cloister, it's a good time to assess the evidence relating to the cloister arcade. Here we have some actual stuff, although it's no longer attached to the building. And different parts of the arcade have been recorded at different times from different contexts. And sometimes these records overlap, and sometimes they do not. In 1914, William Letherby was the earliest to record the fragments from Southwark, 2 double foliage capitals plus 1 fragment, and 2 matching bases. He described the foliage capitals as extremely beautiful and of French character, and belonging to the Canterbury School of around 1190. Another had 2 boldly cut dragons. Another set of material emerged from the excavations in the area of the chapter house in 1969 to 72, and I'm grateful to the excavator, Graham Dawson, who informed me that it came from a post-medieval wall built across the chapter house, and especially to Mark Samuel, who wrote a report in 2012 based only on a set of drawings, here's one of them, and who very kindly sent me his copy of those drawings. Partially overlapping these are the small group of stones still at the cathedral, which I have seen, and photographs at the Conway Library, taken I think in 1979, and now available under a Creative Commons license. I'm going to start at the bottom and work my way up. Only Letherby mentions 2 bases, although they were, fortunately, incidentally photographed below a capital in 1979. So this flat attic base has rather charming foliate spurs, a bit like upside-down water leaves, while the incised divisions on the scotia might hint at faceted rather than round shafts. In fact, no suitable shafts have been recorded, save for this single piece of Purbeck marble, one side of which is slightly cut back, but I have no evidence at all to place it in the cloister rather than elsewhere. Let's see what happens, yes. Next, we have the capitals, which I've already partly described. Today, one of the foliage capitals is severely decayed, while the corner fragment and the twining dragons are missing. Above the capitals, it is much more speculative. As it stands, there is no evidence of a further separate abacus moulding over the capitals, but there are 2 candidates for the arch, one represented only by double springers and the other represented only by voussoirs. The 2 double springers survive at the cathedral and were recut for building material on at least one occasion, as were the voussoirs, shown here in the middle. We can see both how similar they are and how different. The springers would have described a rather steep 2-centred arch with a plain soffit and a front roll with chevrons above. The springer is very narrow, it would easily have fitted onto the double capitals, and the chevrons create the rather pleasing diaper pattern on the front, which would have disappeared as the arches divide. However, although the size is fine for the capitals, and there's nothing wrong with the potential date range, both stones are broken at the rear, hinting at a blind arcade of some sort, while the size of this very steep arch, actually too big to be measurable, seems unlikely for a cloister. By contrast, the voussoirs definitely describe a smaller arch, and they are also clearly for a double-sided arcade, since the chevron moulding appears on both sides of the diaper-decorated soffit. The moulding is quite different from the springers, since here the chevrons are carved with large rolls, emphasised with a further chevron roll above, mostly cut off with a quirk between. These are the 3 still at the cathedral. 5 were also recorded after the excavation. I showed you one drawing earlier, along with some small matching fragments. But it is difficult to perfectly match the drawings with the stones. My comments are drawn principally from the stones that I've actually seen. First, I want to establish what is real and what is not real in the geometry of the stones. Obviously, there's a lot of wear and damage, but additionally, the faces shown in red here are later recuts. None of the extrados survives. It has either been worn away or straightened, in the case of the central voussoir here, cutting through the outer chevron roll. Additionally, the sides of the stones have in 2 cases also been trimmed in order to make the whole stone easier to reuse in a wall, and so the tops would have formed part of a later wall face. And this is quite apparent in the tooling shown on the right. What is real, shown in blue, are the soffits and most of the sides. Only one is missing, which has been broken off. This gave me something for 2 rather basic reconstructions, shown on the right, but you can also see how imperfect they are. The top arch is made up of repetitions of the middle voussoir, because that has 2 nice sides surviving, giving a large semicircular arch with an inner radius of around 810 millimetres, while the bottom one combines the 2 more complete voussoirs, giving an arch of only 430 millimetres, that is. Meantime, I measured the diameter as roughly 440 to 460 millimetres, based on all 3 voussoirs at the cathedral, while Mark Samuel calculated diameters of 530 and 600 millimetres, based on the excavator's drawings. A closer look, however, apparent in the lower arch, shows that the 2 side faces of the larger voussoir, that's also the one at the top on the left, are asymmetrical with respect to the chevron. And since both tapered faces are original, this could not have come from a round arch, but the stone must have been the apex of a pointed arch, which works well with the larger diameter of my regular voussoirs. And this is obviously a good point to attempt a full, if Spartan, reconstruction with the fine capitals, the bases seen by Letherby, and drawing in the complete outer chevron rolls and the double springer. Given the base detailing, I've chosen to assume alternating round and octagonal shafts. There are some similarities to Augustinian Bridlington Priory, whose arcade is of a very similar date, and here are Stuart Harrison's reconstructions. I think of particular interest is Stuart's reconstruction of one design as a pointed arch rather than a round arch, and there might once have been similar variation at Southwark. Mark Samuel rightly raised the potential issue of a mismatch between the arcade depth indicated by the voussoirs and that indicated by the capitals. The latter we do know, it was around 485 millimetres or 19 inches, while the damage inflicted upon the voussoirs means I cannot know this at all precisely. All the outer chevron rolls have been cut back, and 2 of the 3 I have seen demonstrate the presence of a third major moulding element, whether a chevron or a simple moulding. Since the maximum surviving depth I have seen is only 230 millimetres, completing the outer chevron, adding a further quirk and an outer moulding on each side of the soffit, this could easily bring the overall depth to 330 millimetres, which would then fit comfortably on top of the capital. So I'm cautiously going to stay with this reconstruction. The different elements, base, capitals, voussoirs, not at all like those at Bridlington, which is not surprising since the masons of Bridlington were looking towards York for their inspiration and those of Southwark towards Canterbury. Nonetheless, Southwark's arcade does have a sculptural richness that is similar both to Bridlington and to 13th century Augustinian arcades like Norton and Hormond, a contrast perhaps with the more austere moulded arcades of the Cistercian cousins. The 3D chevron is also found locally at Cluniac Bermondsey, just down the river, which has examples of 2 and 3 chevron rolls per voussoir. The dragon capital perhaps hints that there may have been other animals and even figural sculpture, perhaps as hood moulds or in the spandrels or on the inner corners of the arcade, as found in other Augustinian cloisters, which leads nicely to some actual figural sculpture from Southwark Priory. By now, in our tour around the cloister, we are back at the southeast corner by the church, and I'm going to look at 3 other fragments that were also found in the post-medieval wall across the chapter house. Although this group is sculptural, my principal aim today is to put it in its architectural context, which would have been significantly easier if I had actually seen the fragments myself. Following the 1970s excavation, this small group was in the care of the Cumming Museum, a rather sort of eclectic collection held in Southwark, originally created by the Cumming family in the 18th and 19th centuries, later given to the borough. The building they were housed in was mostly destroyed by fire in 2013. Fortunately, almost all the collection survived and was hurriedly packed and put into storage. Despite the best efforts of Judy Aitken, who must wear very many hats as well as curator, and Chris Constable, the Southwark Borough archaeologist, the sculpture from the chapter house site has not yet emerged from the very deep pile of crates. I nearly wanted to include an image from the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, but hey. However, very fortunately, there are 2 sets of surviving photographs. One is from the Conway Library at the Courtauld, and I'm so grateful for the recent digitisation project, which means that they are all available online and for reuse under a Creative Commons licence. They were taken in 1979, and all the black and white photographs I'll show here are from the Conway Library. The second set I've had access to were taken by Bruce Watson in 2012, who has kindly allowed me to use them today, and so all the colour photographs you will see are his, and they're especially useful in showing surviving polychromy. Bruce also wrote a brief preliminary report for the still forthcoming excavation publication, which has been enormously useful in supplying measurements for my reconstruction, as well as several other details. 2 of the 3 fragments belong to a Christ in Majesty, identified by his general disposition, named Halo, and the book in his left hand. Because it's so fragmentary, I've included a drawing made by the excavator, which shows some extra detail, such as the embroidered collar. Christ is sitting on a long bench, which has part of an arch under its left-hand end. Well, you can see that, with an estimated radius of 320 millimetres. In 2012, Bruce Watson observed shoulder-length hair bearing traces of brown paint. The interior of the halo was painted red, as also the chamfer background. The lower part of the background contained traces of blue paint. The third fragment is a more complete synagogue, which has synagogue in the centre and 2 figures on her left side. A synagogue is clearly identified by the blindfold over her eyes and the scar of a staff running down from her left hand. There's also a broken projecting section by her head that might be the remnant of whatever was at the top of her staff, probably a pennant. Her clothes are rich, and the whole was richly painted. The chamfer behind her head is red, the lower background blue. There are traces of gold or yellow paints visible in the recesses of her hair, and her inner robes appear to have been white and the outer one red. The small folds above her waist look like tiny flames, whether deliberate or not. She also sits on a cushion or bench and is leaning to her left. Where the front of the bench is undamaged, on the right, her left, there's a small relief cross. Obviously, I couldn't do that much with the photographs. A further symbol of the triumph of the church, while the positioning of her arms might suggest that she was holding or dropping the tablet of the law from her left hand. The 2 figures on the right are also seated, seemingly on the haunch of an arch, and appear to be 2 concerned, probably Jewish figures, I think both men and both wearing prayer shawls, though I've not actually seen that elsewhere, the prayer shawls that is, though I'm hoping some of you might have. One's grasping his chin, the other his shawl, looking on at synagogue. Excuse me. as well as their context of discovery, their size, the outer chamfer moulding, the background colours, the bench link the synagogue scene firmly with the Christ in Majesty. Turning now to the architecture, it's reasonably apparent that these figures form part of two spandrels. For synagogue, the outer curvature with its broad red chamfer is clear, as is its extrados, with a radius of around 760 millimetres. And in this photo, you can also clearly make out the small vertical edge to the chamfer, which was painted white. Other curves can be seen in the photographs. The one below the male figures has already been mentioned, and I don't have a completely straight-on view of it, but it might be a tight curve of around only 120 millimetres in radius. And another below and to the left of synagogue, with a radius that's here and here, with a radius of around 160 or 170 millimetres. Okay. But the arch below Christ's right knee is of a different radius. You'll note, by the way, that here I swapped the Conway Library head for Bruce Watson's head in order to achieve a better straight-on view. At this point, I went a bit mad and tried about 1,000 options, which is honestly best not to bore you with. So I returned to what could actually be seen, namely, the benches in each case were horizontal, the figures were enclosed within a round arch, both Christ and synagogue have small arches below them of different radii, and although the figures are of similar size, the architectural features are not necessarily the same. It's also worth noting, apologies for that. It's also worth noting that while the fronts of the small arches are completely broken off on synagogue, below Christ there's a classic early Gothic moulding with a front roll possibly slightly keeled or gouged with a flat soffit behind. And it's possible there was a matching roll on the rear. I'm not certain what the lump at the bottom is here, probably part of a broken cusp or some other decorative elaboration. So turning to the more complete synagogue panel, and given the small arches, the obvious first approach was to suppose a trefoil opening each side by mirroring each surviving arch, the lower one on the left and the upper one on which the male figures are sitting on the right, and they've all been mirrored twice. And there's an immediate problem. I've also added a roll, to make it look for verisimilitude. There's also an immediate problem, and that is there isn't enough room below the outer arch to fit the trefoils. And this led me to reconstruct two alternatives. The first was to slightly enlarge the round arch so that it enclosed the trefoils below. But here, perhaps unsatisfactorily, the outer moulding is incomplete, and the trefoils are tucked into this outer moulding, but just as the figures are. The figural sculpture, though, that's by which I mean the male figures because it's not complete on the other side, ends at exactly the point at which the inner arch ends in this reconstruction, where it is framed by a near vertical projection. It's rather difficult to make out here and here from the top of the trefoil, my proposed trefoil. So here, I've given it an outer order for the arch and capitals, shafts, etc., purely for verisimilitude, as I have no evidence over their original appearance at all. I've copied the cloister capitals, though they may not be exactly the same date as the sculpture. Each light here is about 570 millimetres wide at the springing and 680 millimetres or 27 inches between the shafts. Not quite happy with this sort of dying moulding, I decided to reconstruct an alternative where instead of a round arch surrounding the whole scene, I imagine a trefoiled arch, so that there are trefoils below trefoils, so that I had to adjust the sizes of the small circles a bit, But of course, I was not working from direct measurements, nor from remotely complete stones. So fudging seems to be the way to go. So this is plausible, if a bit squashed looking, and this is what it looks like with capitals, etc., added for verisimilitude. Each light here is 584 millimetres wide at the springing and 724 millimetres or 28.5 inches between the shafts. As with the previous reconstruction, the architectural detail fits well with the end of the sculpture, though I've yet to find decent comparative examples for the rather messy arrangement of trefoils below trefoils elsewhere, though you may know some. But there is an example from the post-fire nave of the Priory Church in the south porch doorway, where trefoils and cinquefoils sit below a cinquefoil above the multiple trefoils of the double opening, an arrangement still visible in Arthur Blomfield's copy of the early Gothic original. So here are my two versions, side by side. So now it's time to return to the fragmentary Christ figure, now from an architectural perspective. To summarise the architectural detail, the architectural clues, they're the chamfer moulding at the top, the bottom of that chamfer, which is only very slightly curved, and the small arch with a front roll on the lower left. So what happens if I swap this figure into my designs instead of the synagogue scene? Well, I've already said they're different radiuses, so sadly, and despite the similarities in paint and outer arch and the disposition of the two main figures sitting on their benches, this did not work at all. In the first place, the small lower arch is in completely the wrong place, and in the second, the edge of the outer moulding, which runs directly behind the head of Christ, also barely matches. So, could I reimagine it in a similar feature, but more closely matching the architectural features? There are a variety of options, and I explored two, but I must point out that with so little remaining, there's been a lot more trial and error than science than I would like. So here, I have broadly followed the earlier round-headed design, which I've shown you on the right, to accommodate the large diameter of the lower arch. The chamfer moulding in which the head rests must be broader than that of the synagogue panel. But once more, that moulding is incomplete, with the lower arches nestled within it. Here, the lights are 624 millimetres at the springing points and 723 or 28.5 inches between the shafts. My second option followed the earlier trefoil-headed version, shown lower left, but here, lower right, but here the larger lower arch means the whole composition is much wider, 995 millimetres at the springing point and about 1 metre and 10 centimetres or 43 inches between the shafts. This is fine, except that the architectural break behind Christ now looks rather abandoned, while the field above him is very large. I suppose you could fill it with angels. But where did this architecture and these sculptures belong? Now we are absolutely in the realm of speculation. It is possible that they could have formed part of the cloister arcade, but if so, it was a completely different section with a completely different design from the reconstruction we've seen earlier. However, the iconography is loaded, and I would like to suggest a different location, namely the chapter house entrance, partly because there is almost certainly a missing third element, namely ecclesia or the church, who might have sat on a similar bench at Christ's right hand. The composition might have looked something like this, which is all very fine, except for the fact it could not have fitted within the relatively narrow confines of the chapter house as we know it from Dolman's plan. I did try to make my trefoils narrower, but found it impossible within the other confines of the design. The option with the round-headed arches could have fitted into the space, coming in at about 80 centimetres narrower, so I could in fact have spaced the three main elements more widely, thus allowing for extra arch orders. Sadly, what I could not do, and I tried, was to make each side of the door entrance any wider, and they stand marginally narrower than a modern house doorway. Despite the design difficulties, I do continue to favour a chapter house location, speculatively of course, a location found over a century later at Rochester. And for the record, I think that the Southwark figures date from around 1190 to 1210. The male drapery and Christ's head with its classical vase, well-formed ears and broad round collar especially remind me of those large standing figures from St Mary's Abbey, York, though I'm definitely open to more discussion with art historians on this matter. Although it's more usual to find ecclesia and synagoga either side of a crucifixion scene, there are 12th century manuscript images of these figures with the Christ in Majesty, and 13th century images of the figures with the prophets or the coronation of the Virgin. Unlike the public location of synagogue and ecclesia on the font at Southwark, Gloucestershire, thanks to Ron Baxter for both the reference and the picture, my example is in the heart of the cloister, which, when it was built, is likely to have been accessible only to a few: the canons, their elite guests, and most certainly the Bishop of Winchester. Let's go back. As noted at the beginning of this talk, the bishops were close neighbours and continual patrons. Not so much is known about the late 12th century bishops, by which I mean I don't know so much: Richard of Ilchester, 1173 to 88, and Godfrey de Lucy, 1189 to 1204. But Bishop Peter de Roche, who was bishop from 1206 to 38, he is credited with paying for the reconstruction of the church after the fire. His dealings with Jewry in London and his own diocese is well documented, notably on behalf of the Crown, where his approach was slightly less draconian from that across the river in London, and indeed in other cities, at least in his early pre-crusading years of his episcopate. However, really, what is important in this proposed Augustinian chapter house context is the triumph of Christ and the church, to which the defeat of synagogue is a literal sideshow. By being present and potentially looked upon, whenever a canon or a bishop walked the cloister alleys or stepped into the chapter house every day, these sculptures took part in the daily enculturation of anti-Semitism by reminding these people of the blindness of the Jewish people. My thesis is that the architectural location of the sculpture, while highly speculative, is thus as important as the iconography, and comments on this reconstruction will be gratefully received. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for bringing together all these fragments from the archives, from the museums, from your cathedral, and putting them together for us in a way that I think is really difficult to kind of convey the difficulties that have underpinned that presentation. So thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? So Jackie has a... Jackie's very much invited comments, so Richard.
I was going to. It is odd to find ecclesia and synagogue in a cloister. I don't. Does anyone else know of any instances of,
I did,
as it were, rather private presentation of what is very often a very public?
I did mention Rochester, of course, where it is in a cloister.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
In fact, it's in the chapter house entry, but in the as typical of that period, much later, in the jambs of the doorway.
Sorry, I wasn't paying attention properly. Questions?
Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating. Wonderful to see the Conway Library photographs, which taken so long ago, but managed to be quite sharp as well. Really fascinating. I'm just thinking about synagogues and ecclesia. Are they in the cloister at Chalon-sur-Marne? I vaguely think they might be. And the other thing that it reminded me of is at Winchester, there's that wonderful figure of Ecclesia who is in the church, but doesn't she come from a building within the...
Yeah.
and I can't remember exactly where, but that would have had synagogue on it. But she's a bit, I think she's probably slightly later, sort of 12, 10 or something.
She's definitely later.
Yes.
So in this talk, I was sticking more to your earlier ones,
yes,
because, as precedents. But I haven't read the paper, but it said that figure came from the Priory doorway or something. Though
yes,
I have no idea how well established that is.
No. And just to say that the capital, the foliage capital, is very Arras-like and sort of just seems to me sort of marginally earlier than the sculpture. I mean, perhaps, you know, if I was forced to, I'd put it sort of 1180 or something like that, whereas the sculpture looks, you know, 10 years, almost 20 years later.
Yeah, I would be absolutely happy with that difference in dates.
And also the,
you know.
Yes, also the chevron, I mean, again, looks earlier rather than 1200-ish, but fascinating.
No, I absolutely agree. I don't think there's any reason at all to suppose there was chevron in the what I'm considering to be chapter house sculpture. No, not at all. And you know, I'm perfectly happy to swap my foliage capitals of this reconstruction for moulded ones. But then, you know, I did this partly on the basis of speed and partly on the basis of not completely making stuff up, if you see what I mean, because I don't have any capitals for this.
Fascinating, and thank you.
Jackie, that's absolutely wonderful piece of reconstruction. Thank you. The space you identified as the chapter house, do you think that's the chapter house or a chapter house vestibule with the chapter house further east?
Yeah, really interesting question, because the chapter house as it stands now does project further east of the range, that is. And it sort of depends, but it's rather small regardless. And so it's a question, isn't it, of whether was it a vestibule or is it just a straightforward extension? Do you see what I mean?
One might also be thinking of the height constraint of the crypt to its north. And if one thinks of there being a night stair to the dormitory, then you'd have had, as at Westminster Abbey, the low vestibule leading into the high chapter house to the east. And I'm wondering if, as Lindsay identifies a potential disjunction between dates of the capitals and the carvings, whether one might think of these as being from the context of a blind arcade in the chapter house rather than the vestibule entrance.
I did consider that as well, but, you know, for reasons of time, decided not to consider it, but I will now. And the reason I didn't go for that is because I think if it were part of the blind arcade, well, firstly, it doesn't fit with the little bit that survives. And secondly, perhaps more importantly, if it was going to be blind arcade, I could only imagine this iconography sort of at the east where the prior would sit. But then, instead of having a group of 3 arches that are emphasised or a single arch that is emphasised for the prior, what we've got double arches, and I couldn't see that quite working as well in that context.
I just had a mic. Sorry, I've got the power of the microphone. Sorry, you can come next. I thought it was very interesting, that feature which crops up in the bases, that strange vertical slot in the scotia between the two tori of the bases. And that's incredibly rare in England. I mean, what Lindy said about the Frenchness of the capitals is chimed absolutely with my opinion of it too. And also they're very classy too. I mean, they are really superb. But those strange slots, I mean, I used to keep a card index of these things, and I probably could, if pushed, find where I wrote down the other English examples. But they start, as far as I know, on the Porte Royal au Chartres, in the mid-12th century. And they're rare even in France, but you had a drawing up already which showed them. I mean, are those little sort of vertical slots going backwards? I'm not quite sure what the you've seen the capitals. They look smaller in the photograph than they do in the drawing, and they look more like what I'm hoping that I'm talking about in the photograph than in the drawing. But again, it's in England. Although it's a tiny little thing, I do agree. But nevertheless, it's a very, very exotic thing in England.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And, it's so difficult at Southwark to trace the sort of masonry history or the Masonic history because there's so little left. So it's great that you said that. And I read them as from the photograph, where they're little more than incised lines, rather than the way that they've been drawn by William Letherby. But either way, really unusual.
And I just have a question, which, if I adopt the wrong tone, will sound a bit like an interrogation, and I don't mean it to be that. Have you looked at John Carter's drawings in the British Library? Because you reproduced what I think was a redrawing of a Carter drawing, which is very important, obviously, but Carter, what seemed to be Carter's own drawings, so he wasn't putting information into them which other people needed. And what I'm building up to is they can be incredibly difficult to interpret, and they sometimes just degenerate into scribbles, really. But nevertheless, there is a great archive of stuff in the British Library, which is virtually untapped. Yeah. I mean, the recent flurry of activity about St. Stephen's Chapel, for example, nobody refers to those drawings. And maybe they are known about, but they're hard to use. That's a sort of warning as well. But if you're lucky, there might well. I think there are drawings of the Undercroft in there. I'm pretty sure there are, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of on my list, but it's a sort of long list, because I'm thinking, well, what I need to do first is find out how difficult it is to find those drawings of Southwark from the great heap of John Carter's.
Yeah, well, there is an index volume.
There isn't. I will go and look. I knew, of course, that I was just putting up a copy, and that therefore there was an original that I must find. Yeah. But I haven't done it yet.
No, but there'll probably be more information than the drawing you reproduced, if you're lucky. You can never tell.
Fingers crossed.
It's a brand tub, really. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Jackie. I just wondered the extent to which the cart may have been leading the horse with the chapter house doorway, in effect. A divided chapter house doorway with a trumeau, I suppose, is not that common. I can't think of an example in the Diocese of Winchester. There is one in the Diocese of London at Beeley Abbey, for example, but they are very rare.
Yeah.
So it's just something to bear in mind, that you might be forcing something into, and that you're aware of that anyway.
Yeah, I'm aware of it. And otherwise, it's a question of where do I locate this, I suppose, because quite clearly the figures are spandrels, and they, clearly have arches each side of them. And if they're not there, does that mean they're in the cloister? But that seems a bit weirdly low-key, I think. It's that, or is it's back to a blind arcade? But as previously discussed, I don't think it would work on the east wall, and the side walls, again, seem a little bit low-key. But, you know, Christopher has just pointed out how wonderfully rare the bases are, though that's the cloister, not this sculpture. But perhaps Southwark is this sort of hotbed of marvellous innovation. And though, as I pointed out, I'm not happy with the narrow width of those of that division, you know?
I can save Christopher from searching out his card index. They cut scotias. There are 3 examples in Norwich, all about the same date.
Brilliant.
Carrow Priory, the infirmary of the cathedral, and the bases at Jernit's house.
Brilliant.
The music house.
I'll be taking notes later.
Yes. I used to think that they were also cuts on the west responds at Southwark. But a little while ago, not very long ago, I actually ran my finger round and they're painted. Now, why would anybody paint them? They must have known these bases were there. They must have seen these bases at some point. But who would have done it? I don't know.
Yeah, very interesting.
We're now just past 6 o'clock. We have the reception after the lecture, so please stay around for a drink, and we also have a book launch, so please buy books. But thank you very much, Jackie, for a really wonderful presentation to finish off our series. Do you go through them?